Welcome to the sixth episode of Free Kiwis podcast. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Bali Haque, who has been a principal of many schools in New Zealand, also Deputy Chief Executive of the New Zealand Qualifications Authority during a fairly tumultuous period in the first decade of this century. And more latterly, Bali has chaired the Tomorrow Schools Review Task Force for the current government, and I believe is chair of the New Plymouth branch of the New Zealand Labour Party. Is that right, Bali?
That's correct, yeah. Yep.
Well, it's really great to have you. And of course, we got to know each other during those days at NZQA, and it was kind of a friendship forged in the heat of battle, metaphorically speaking. It was quite an interesting time. And of course, we've had many discussions about education, politics, and life over the years. And I'd like to visit some of those issues today. But first of all, could you perhaps speak a bit about your background, why it was you came to New Zealand from the UK as a fairly young man, I think, and perhaps what kept you in New Zealand all these years?
Oh, well, it's a fascinating question, really. Yes. No, I came to New Zealand, first of all, in 1975. And we were on our overland trip from the UK. We did the usual we took about 6 months coming here and 6 months going back after 2 years here. And we never intended to come back to New Zealand. We were done, sort of thing. And after returning to the UK, where I was educated, I was born in Pakistan, of course, but I was educated in the UK. Spent 4 or 5 years there, and then I got a phone call from New Plymouth Spotswood College. Would you like to come back? And I have to say that we came back. We had two very small children at that time. The combination of, oh well, what the hell? Why don't we? There was a bit of that in it. It's funny what you do when you're young, relatively young. And also, I think we came back because of what we saw happening in the UK. Particularly, I suppose, in some of the social, economic things that were going on, and bringing up children there. And I can talk about that later in terms of what's happening in the UK now. But and the attraction of New Zealand, of course, small place. We just love being here, and we have ever since.
Yeah, right. And so, what was it about the UK that was a kind of push factor for you at that time?
I think it's fascinating. Sometimes it's very bad to get into the what if. Well, I've been doing the what ifs recently as I've been aging. And one of the things that we thought about carefully was bringing up our kids. We were the first wave of Pakistani immigrants that came into the UK. So my father arrived in 1954, so pretty early. And we saw what was, we went through the Enoch Powell rivers of blood speeches. We went through, and there was a whole pile of things happening there around some of the issues around ethnicity and race. And we made the call that we didn't want to be part of that. And New Zealand beckoned. Mm. It's fascinating looking at what's happening to the UK now, of course, where you could argue it's one of the more successful countries in the way it's dealt with immigrants. You could argue that.
Yeah.
But in terms of a sort of a multicultural society, but we've had no regrets really of coming to New Zealand. I think our kids have had a wonderful life, a wonderful upbringing.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm here in New Plymouth now. The sun is shining. We've got the sea to look at and the mountains to look at. What more could I ask for?
So, since you raised this issue of racism, which I've no doubt was rife when your father arrived in the UK and was probably still rife in the 1970s when you left. And as you say, since then, really the UK and I suppose New Zealand and other countries have gone through a process of self-examination and coming to terms with multiculturalism with varying degrees of success, I suppose. And yet now we find ourselves at this point where it's suddenly a huge issue again. What are your reflections on that as somebody who lived through some of really quite difficult stuff when racism was very overt, and no doubt you were a target for it as a child, and your family was probably involved in some nasty stuff, or the target of some nasty stuff. What do you make of the present moment in terms of the extent to which it's flared up again as a huge issue?
Oh, it's a biggie. I'm ambivalent. On the one hand, if you look at what's happening with the Black Lives Movement, for example, you've got to applaud the way that people are being challenged now about the way that they think and the way that the institutions in countries work. I mean, that whole systemic racism discussion, which we might have as well. But so you got to applaud that, because it does make people examine their assumptions and examine the way that communities are built and work. So I sort of get that. On the other hand, I'm really getting concerned about, I'm not the first to talk about the identity politics that is now increasingly rearing its head, and I think the New Zealand left, or the left wings across the board perhaps, have got themselves into a argument about identity, whether it's ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or whatever. That we're into this area of debate. But what I think we are in danger of, because that's created a reaction on the right as well, if you want to categorize in that way. But I think what we're in danger of is, from my perspective anyway, going to the root causes of some of the socio-economic issues that we have to face. And they are, from my perspective, issues around power and economics and, if you like, ideology, I suppose, in terms of how we operate. So the identity politics, in a way, for me, is potentially getting in the way of long-term, deep-rooted change, which is what I think we need.
Right, and you're talking about taking it perhaps out of those social categories and looking perhaps more at the traditional concern of the left, which is social class. Would that be a fair way to?
Yeah. I think I'm in that pretty traditional space, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we need to be having much stronger debates about how we create wealth, how we distribute wealth, how we tax people, all of those sorts of things, rather than discussions around identity. And I think there's a danger that we can lose the wood for the trees.
Yeah, something that concerns me greatly is what I see as an assault largely from the left on some of the fundamental underpinnings of democracy. And one of those things is free speech, or the free expression of ideas. And of course, there is in the offing in New Zealand at the moment some kind of hate speech legislation. The government has announced that. I'm not sure where their plans are at. You may have a better idea than me. But I guess what disturbs me about that is that, well, at least when I was a young man, when I was a child, the left was a champion of free speech. The civil rights movement really thrived on that tradition, the ability to freely express ideas. And now it seems that the left is, I mean, the left is not a monolith, of course, and you probably count yourself being on the left, but many on the left seem to be turning to authoritarianism as a way to impose their ideology or their ideas, rather than having it out in the marketplace of ideas, as it were. What's your take on that in New Zealand, and how do you see it playing out? Do you think that hate speech legislation will come before Parliament and be passed into law, or do you think that we push back? How do you see it?
I mean, clearly it's tied up with the identity politics stuff, isn't it? That's, I suppose, there's a connection that you've made, that if you focus on the identity stuff and gender and race and ethnicity, then you're into the business about where people end up viewing their lives from their particular bubble, their gender or their race, and they don't view things from something that is bigger, so a value system that perhaps is wider than just the identity, your personal identity. So to answer your question, I suppose I find it really difficult because what we've got now is being amplified so much by social media, and that we've got this big amplification going on, and it worries me a great deal that we've got ourselves into a position where Facebook or a committee appointed by Facebook, supposedly independent, is making decisions about what is appropriate to be put on media and what is not. So that worries me, that we need to have some mechanism where, if we're going to do something about influencing what gets put on social media or is made public, we need something better than a Facebook committee to do it, if we need anything at all. So it's that leads me, I suppose, to a discussion around, well, if we're going to limit what people's freedom of speech is going to be about, on what basis do we do it? And I'm still struggling with this, but I'm coming to the view that, given that there is this huge issue around what is fact and what is not, that we need to have, given the amplification of social media, some mechanisms for ensuring that what is put on is factual. That's the first thing. But then you move on to what is hate speech, and what is opinion and what is hate speech, and it gets into a really difficult space. I still think personally that given that we're where we are with social media, we need to have some mechanisms for dealing with that. Some would argue that they exist in the law already.
Well, certainly you can't threaten people, and you can't incite violence or anything like that. I guess there are two issues, aren't there? One, well, you've separated two issues. One is matters of fact, or whether something is true or not, and another is what people don't necessarily purport to be true, but it's their opinion. It's what they want to say, and they are slightly separate things. But how would you respond to the idea that democracy depends fundamentally on people being able to say more or less anything, short of incitement to violence or threats, in order to be able to have ideas thrashed out properly in a way that allows people to feel as if they've got a proper stake in the way decisions are made?
I agree. The 70 million people odd that voted for Trump, they are not all unthinking people, are they?
Well, one would hope not.
No.
Yeah.
And yet, when we sit here in New Zealand and talk about it, so often we hear, how can 70 million people possibly vote for Trump? So we sort of live in different bubbles, don't we? So to that extent, I suppose my question is, with the amplification of social media and the possibilities of people turning, if you like, to the mob, if I can use that word, if we go down the track of people saying what they want to say, how do we ensure that the debate stays in a realm which is broadly acceptable? How do you define that? So what I'm trying to say is, on the one hand, if you shut that down, it's patronizing. You're saying to people, we're going to stop you saying these things because we don't think it's appropriate for you to say them. That's one side of it. On the other side of it, you've still got the issue about people uh, creating an environment where you get the authoritarian rule, and you get people being sucked into a society which they don't necessarily want.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this in the aftermath of the Congress riot, to the attack on the U.S. Congress, and it seemed like there was some presence among those people of the QAnon conspiracy theorists, right? Which strikes me as one of the crazier conspiracy theories that have been going around. So I think it's reasonable to think there must be something going on with social media. So at some points, I'm sort of on your side. I think we have to do something about social media, but then on the other hand, it's not the case that there were no riots and there were no attacks on Congresses and parliaments before social media started, right? So Guy Fawkes tried to blow up Parliament in the UK. He wasn't on Twitter. He wasn't on Reddit. So I think it's one of the things Steven Pinker talks about, that we tend to forget how bad things were in the past, and in particular, I think, as Pinker has shown, how violent things were in the past. And I'm a bit worried sometimes with some of these arguments, because it seems like some of the arguments in favor of controlling speech now, they look like they're designed for a contemporary world, which is different. And in some ways, they sincerely have been designed that way. People are trying to sort of think about things in the present. But in some ways, they look a lot like the old anti-free speech laws, right? Because the basic idea in both these cases is just, but speech can lead to violence. And it's really hard, but the answer of the people who've usually defended free speech through history has often been, yes, that's true, but the answer to that is to try and restrain the violence and punish people who are engaging in violence, but otherwise to let free speech go. Because, I mean, one of the problems is that if you start saying you can't say that because it may lead to harm, basically or the vast majority of political theories, someone will think it leads to harm, right? If you're a socialist, someone will think, that might lead to communism, it's terrible. If you're on the other side, you might think, your right-wing ideas might lead to fascism, that's terrible. And it's very hard to sort of clamp down on these things evenly. So, I'll just put that back to
you. So if you take the recent example of, what's his name, Banks, getting on Talkback Radio, did you pick that up?
Yes.
Talked about Māori being Stone Age people. So how would you deal with that? Because he said it, and the result was he was lambasted appropriately by people, and he was sacked. That's enough. We don't need a law. Is that what?
Yeah, I sort of think so. I sort of think people saying things that, if people say things that are disgraceful and people react to it by disgracing them, that is the appropriate response. I mean, I just think you kind of embarrass yourself more effectively than others can do it for you. And indeed, I think, I don't know if it's the case here, but I do think in many of these cases, this is again a pretty old argument, but it seems like, if someone says something stupid or kind of mean or racist or whatever, nowadays there's a pretty effective social mechanism that they just get disgraced, and then if it's almost like you can ruin that advantage. You can interfere with that natural response by doing something that people can describe as persecution, right? Because then that makes that person a hero.
That seems to me a very great danger of going beyond simply using counter speech. So as James said, somebody like John Banks says stuff on Talkback Radio that is offensive and deserves ridicule. Well, that seems to me the right response, and there will be a certain number of people out there who agree with him. And if you do prosecute him, say, under hate speech legislation, then you do tend to make a martyr of him, and the people who agree with him are not going to change their views because he's been prosecuted or even because he's been shut up. I suppose one of my arguments for having even really quite horrible stuff being allowed to be said, as it were, under the law, is that if you don't allow it to be said, it doesn't mean that it won't be thought, and it doesn't mean that it won't be talked about. it will just be talked about underground, where you don't know what's going on and you can't keep a handle on it. And not only that, you'll breed a sense of persecution amongst the people who have those opinions, and sooner or later they're likely to emerge into the public sphere violently.
Yeah. Yeah, I take that point, but I'll just throw this in as an alternative view, which is worth debating perhaps, that particularly in small countries, that is there any mileage in saying that those sorts of statements, and whether they be anti-Semitic or homophobic or whatever, that those sorts of statements, that what you want to do is to build a culture, a national culture, a set of values, a cohesive national culture and set of values, where actually you're prepared to say, well, you may think that, but you better not say it. And so here's a law. So it over a period of time, it creates a culture and a set of values where it's taboo. You can't do it. It's not acceptable.
I'm not sure that it will create the culture that you want if you do that. I think it will create a culture of resentment where people, if they feel stifled, if they feel as if they can't say what they think, well, they will still think it, and sooner or later, some members of those groups may react angrily in a violent way. Whereas if you allow people to speak, but then you speak back to them and you do ridicule hateful things, then it's more likely that over time you will get the outcome you want, which is a kind of acceptance. I mean, I think we've seen that happen with homosexuality in my lifetime. I recall very well at the age of 17 walking down Lambton Quay with my gay piano teacher and his partner in support of the homosexual law reform bill, and having bottles thrown at us. And, 3 decades later, we have homosexual marriage with very little resistance or problem. In 2014 or whenever it was that came into play, it was almost a natural thing to do. And that was
sorry, keep going.
Well, my point is it was in an environment where people could always say what they want, and people did say nasty things about homosexuals for a long time. But I noticed that in about 1995, it became no longer socially acceptable to do that. And now very few people ever will. And we don't seem to need to have hate speech legislation to have enacted that culture change.
Although we sort of did have legislation, didn't we? I mean,
we had legislation that you couldn't discriminate against people for being gay, which is not the same, though, as saying that you can't say things that are bigoted about homosexuals.
I mean, I'm agreeing with you, actually, but there is an argument for, those two things can work in tandem, that legislation or rules working alongside social change or expectations which aren't rule-based necessarily, working together could create the changes that we want. I don't really know what kind of hate speech legislation we're talking about. Do we have any?
Well, I don't think that there's been nothing very specific put on the table. Of course, it came about in response to the Christchurch massacre, with all of the more than understandable opprobrium that attracted towards anti-Islamic bigotry. But so I think the idea is that it will cover religious vilification, whatever that might be. I mean, it seems to me that one real minefield there is separating religious vilification from simply disagreeing with the tenets of a religion, and whether that becomes, unviable as
Yeah, and I'll add there actually that I think that this is my worry about a lot of these plans to sort of stamp out bigotry, because I mean it's not like I love bigotry, and I think I agree with Michael that in a lot of good ways, there are various forms of bigotry that have decreased or even basically disappeared over time, at least in sort of polite society. But there's always a risk, because what one person thinks is sort of just offensive hate speech or whatever, to another person it's criticism, and not only criticism, but sometimes sort of justified, righteous criticism. I mean, and you can have too strong a sense of your own righteousness, of course, but I mean, the religious issue is a great example, because maybe you don't think that that particular religious belief is true, and moreover, maybe you believe that it's harmful, right? And actually, we can probably all think of styles of religion, especially if we go far enough back into the past, that we would all agree are harmful. So, but I mean, I've even had this experience within my own life. If you say to a sincere religious person, "I think this belief is both incorrect and harmful," they are usually offended by it, because they believe that belief is both true and beneficial, right? And there's really no way of getting around that. I mean, the way of getting through it is just to sort of try and appreciate that the other person has a different point of view. But this is sort of my fear, that there are a lot of criticisms that actually should be in the public sphere, and it's kind of quite easy to say, oh, that's just bigotry. I mean, another thing that springs to mind a little bit is, I mean, we often hear criticisms of men, for example. So people say, well, men commit lots of violent crimes. This is true. Men are more violent than women, and they commit more violent crimes, right? So again, from some perspective, we could describe that as hate speech, because it's a sweeping statement about men. It has a negative evaluation of men, etc. But I don't think anyone would want to say we can't criticize men, or we can't say that men have committed more violent crimes, right?
Where's the line between criticism, hate speech, and incitement?
And who gets to draw it? I mean, incitement, I'd say that's a reasonably well traversed area in jurisprudence. We know where the line between incitement and other forms of speech is, because it's been thrashed out in the courts over centuries, actually. The line between venturing an opinion and hate speech is another matter. And another problem that gets raised by any attempt to do so is who gets to make that call. And inevitably, it's going to be whatever political force is ascendant at the time. And so people that defend hate speech laws because they want to avoid a particular kind of political discourse being in the public sphere should be careful what they wish for, because sooner or later it's extremely likely to come back to bite them.
Yeah. So if I make a statement which is anti-Semitic or anti-Islamic, I don't believe in such and such a, why do Muslims allow people to have 4 wives, etc. If I make a statement like that and it's regarded as a criticism, I wouldn't class that as hate speech. Is anybody suggesting that would become hate speech?
Well, that's the problem. I mean, it's precisely that there's a sort of lack of clarity around that, and that because I think that actually Ardern and Andrew Little, my impression is that they're going to do something modeled on the British example of similar legislation. And I think a journalist asked her when she was, I think she was at a memorial service for the victims of the Christchurch attack, and the journalist just said, is the hate speech? Are you going to look at hate speech laws? Is it going to encompass religion, sexuality, and a few other things? And she said, yeah. I mean, can't expect her to have a perfectly formulated legal description right off the bat, but so I think that's an indication just of the way she's thinking about this at the moment, I think. Yeah, I think that it's just very difficult to know where to stop, because often these laws get brought in and they say something quite vague, like you're not allowed to express an opinion which is condemnatory or expresses contempt towards another way of life. And so the example you brought up, I mean, imagine you think that having 4 wives is misogynistic or whatever.
Yeah.
Or you can imagine such a view. So if I say that, someone might look at it and say, well, look, you just said that Islam is misogynistic, or you said that a practice within Islam is misogynistic. Isn't that sort of hateful of Islam? And in a sense, it sort of is, right? I mean, I suppose you could respect the religion in general, but just be criticizing that one thing. But it's very hard to, I mean, it'd be very easy to make the argument that you're just generally being down on Islam, right? And then we'd be in this position where we're risking sort of punishing people, finding them, and putting them in jail for intellectual criticisms. And I think Michael and I are sort of acutely aware of academics that it's not only that, some people may be punished and some people may not be punished, and there will be court processes, but it's also the effects that ripple outward from that. So just the uncertainty. Imagine you're teaching a class about religion, and you say, well, the Christians said this, but actually, the book of Genesis says this, but actually, we now think that there was evolution by natural selection. I don't think that example is going to end up in court, but I mean, any discussion like that, at the back of your mind, you're always going to be thinking, ooh, I might get in trouble for this. And that has a tremendously negative effect on our ability to discuss ideas.
Yeah, I suppose we don't know, do we? I mean, I don't know what the British legislation is, but it would seem to me, if we're going to go down this track, the legislation would have to, you would have to be working on the basis of the context that whoever is speaking in, and you'd have to build a picture. I mean, hate speech is hardly going to be, I don't know, it's hardly going to be one sentence or a phrase. It's going to be something that somebody says, which is, it sits in a context, which then you make a judgment about whether it's hateful or whether it's a genuine debate. We don't. I mean, as you say, where the line is drawn, I don't know.
Well, I hope so. I mean, maybe you're right, and they can be nuanced about this and build up a kind of legislation that is precise enough. But I have a lot of fears on that front. But I want to just go back to something you were saying before about sort of how this all started, and you were talking about how identity politics has a certain sort of solipsism that people just focus on themselves, and maybe that's what's led to restrictions in speech. Because, of course, if I'm a Canadian and only Canadians can speak about, Canadian experiences, then other people can't. I'm kind of interested in your experiences in the UK, though, because one of the other things I think has happened is that when Michael was rightly talking about, even in my lifetime in the 90s, I can remember the left was more into free speech. I mean, basically both sides of the political spectrum paid sort of honor to free speech, because there was still sort of a sense that we weren't the Soviets and stuff like that. But it was more the left that was defending free speech. It was more the right, especially the religious right, that was sort of suspicious of it. Now I know that Eric Kaufman at the LSE has a sort of beautifully simple, perhaps too simple theory that it's really just a matter of the left coming to power in institutions. I think in the UK is an interesting example, because I think when I first moved to the UK with my family from Canada in the 90s, a lot of institutions were still quite conservative. Oxford and Cambridge were more powerful. I think sort of private schools were more powerful. The school teachers, I mean, in the 70s and 80s, my sense was that in Britain, school teachers tended to be more conservative, and that is all reversed quite significantly. So is it just a matter of, like, once one side gets in power, it's just a question of human nature that everybody kind of wants to continue their advantage and sort of use it to the best, to the utmost when they get power?
I don't. I think it's. I don't know. I think it's bigger than that. I think that it's interesting, as you say, that the left wing was all about free speech. It's actually flipped, hasn't it? In a way, it's the right. If you want to classify it, it's gone the other way now, and the left wing want to restrict what you say, and the right wing want to, talk about freedom of speech and stuff like that. So that's it. But I think this identity stuff is really interesting, because I think it is a fundamental sort of issue which is beginning to tear Western democracies apart. That we're in a position where, and it's something to do, I suspect, with inequality as well, sitting in there. But I think that the more we splinter off into identities, the more friction we get, the less cohesion we get as a country. I was reading, what's his name? Fukuyama. Is that right? Francis Fukuyama?
Yeah.
He, I thought it was fascinating because he says, amongst his many suggestions, that we should bring back national service of some sort. Because not necessarily the military kind, but actually getting people to do some national service, whether it be military or otherwise, to begin to talk to each other again across the divides. So trying to build up a sense of community and nationhood. I mean, he even talks about things like, to be un-American was a really interesting bit. We see sitting here that when somebody says, "Oh, it's un-American," we tend to be a bit critical of that, don't we? We tend to think, "Oh," but actually, I mean, his point is that's not a bad thing. If nationally you can say we've got a set of values,
but they have to
put our identities in there. We've got a set of values.
The values of a country have to have broad intuitive appeal. People have to sign up to them by and large voluntarily. They can't be coerced, or you have an authoritarian system that is, well, I think unconscionable and certainly unstable, because you'll have huge elements of your population that resent the status quo. That's not a set of values. That's an imposition of, well, I suppose an imposed set of values is not a democratic set of values. It doesn't sustain democratic processes over time, surely.
But I'm not suggesting that they're imposed.
No, I know you're not, but there is something behind the idea that we need to suppress ideas we don't like that tends in that direction.
Yeah, I agree. But I think what I'm saying, I mean, that's the really hard basket, right? So how do you deal with all of that friction? And I suppose I'm just thinking that, what's causing all that? What's causing this bubbling, this incredible, it's sort of division that's going on in not so much New Zealand, but in other societies, Western liberal democracies, if you like, and whilst the authoritarian regimes look on and say, "What a mess you've made." What's causing all that? And for me, it's that business about cohesion as a community. And it sort of goes to the free speech debate, doesn't it? A little bit in terms of, what are the acceptable things that we can be saying, given our set of values, and our set of values as a community, as a country, whatever. And that's maybe another way of addressing some of these free speech issues. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's a complicated thing. I do sympathize with where you're going, though, and I think you're right about nationalism in particular. So it's interesting because the idea that nationalism has caused harms in the past and even horrors is an obviously true one. I mean, there's a reason that we moved away from nationalism in the liberal West because of all the wars that it's caused in the past, and also the kind of xenophobia that people have often experienced. So I guess I try and be sort of balanced in my thinking. There's an extent to which nationalism can have all these bad effects, but I don't think we should throw it out entirely, because one of the things that it does is it seems to be one of the only forces that brings people together across class lines. And nowadays too, because we mostly live in sort of multi-ethnic, multicultural societies, it's one of the only things that brings all those groups together, right? And that's your worry. And I mean, if you go back to the great French, the great sort of series of three values that the French revolutionaries talked about, liberty, equality, and fraternity. We think a lot about the first two. In fact, at the moment, I think our political culture is almost exclusively focused on equality. But we usually, most of the past few decades, we've also thought about liberty. But the fraternity one is very unfashionable. The idea that we should sort of try and basically be mates with one another. I read something once that apparently when they drew up the Australian Constitution, they thought about putting the word mateship as a value, which I kind of liked. I think that actually fraternity can help us a lot because it deals with some of these sort of problems of schism in our society, right? If we're all New Zealanders, then it doesn't matter if you're a socialist and I'm not, or whatever. We can all sort of agree to disagree, and we're all on the same side, kind of thing. But then the tension is that when you try and build up stronger senses of what it is to be a New Zealander, it can be a little bit dangerous because then you're necessarily kind of excluding some other things, right? And that can become illiberal because we see that, and I think we can see that really clearly in the contrast between some European countries and Canada or New Zealand. I definitely noticed this when I moved from Canada. So I think Canada and New Zealand is like this too. They're countries which were formed by immigrants always, and because of that, they're actually very good at becoming either melting pots or mosaics, depending on whether you want to be Reagan or Pierre Trudeau, the way you want to describe that. But effectively, they're really good at bringing people in and putting them under the broad umbrella of a New Zealand or Canadian identity. If you're in Spain or you're in France or you're in England, even historically, there's been a much clearer idea of, the Spaniards are the people who drink sangria and like bullfighting. I mean, these are stereotypes, but these stereotypes grow up in European countries because they have a much older and much stronger sense of what it is to be an Italian or an Englishman or whatever. It's hard. You got to strike a balance of having some kind of New Zealand identity, but not making it too strong.
Yeah, I mean, this is why Jacinda Ardern's her kindness mantra has been so successful, because people are sort of yearning for something that they can latch onto. I mean, you can criticize it easily, I know, but there is that we all have that business about we want to be all in this together, and I think that's and it's full of fishhooks and difficulties, as you say, as you get more and more to the rubber hits the road stuff. But it's that aspiration that I think that we sometimes, America particularly now has just lost it completely because it's allowed that splintering to occur. France is a really good example. I was talking, my son lives in France and he's telling me about, and I was reading about it, but the way that the French have dealt with their immigrants compared with the way the British have dealt with their immigrants is an interesting sort of debate, neither of which, I mean, the French, you couldn't say is successful, I wouldn't anyway. But I mean, what the French seem to be saying is, if you want to come to live in France, then you've got to assimilate. You've got to learn the French values. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. And you can't have Islamic schools. It's a secular society, and get on with it. While the British have gone the other way, and that they're allowing this many flowers bloom approach. I'm just interested, how does that work? What do you think in terms of?
It seems to me I like the many flowers bloom approach. I like the idea that people can go anywhere and be themselves. I suppose the limits of it might be Popper's paradox of tolerance, which is to say that if you have a completely open slather about values, then that puts in place the facility to undermine tolerance itself. Because if you import intolerant values and allow them to flourish, then you can undo the very fabric that made that multicultural society possible. That's that to me that's the only argument that I actually can conscionably think of against open borders from my libertarian perspective. I like the idea that people can go and live and work wherever they like in the world, but the only limit to that might be you can't overdo the extent to which you undermine the basis of that in the first place.
That's right. So that exactly. So, I mean, so where do you go with that? I mean, at some point you come back to the argument about national values and national cohesion, and on the one hand and identity stuff on the other, and marrying those two things together, it's really hard.
I suppose the globalist in me hopes that we can go beyond nationalism to a more kind of transhumanism, where we accept one another without the need to identify strongly with flags and nations, which, as James said before, in the past have led to, well, still do lead to armed conflict, and so the downside of nationalism is very clear to me, and I suppose I'm an odd case in a way. I've never felt much like a New Zealander. I've never had a strong sense of myself as a New Zealander. I don't know why that is. There are certain things about this country that I love and respond to, but amongst those things are not the flag and the national anthem and so on. And to the extent that I have a sense of myself as a New Zealander, it's as a place that is welcoming to all, I suppose.
Yeah,
so,
but isn't that it? I mean, I'm not talking about patriotism in terms of flag waving. I'm talking about, sort of in a way, what you've just said. That as a New Zealander, you're in a position to say those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that I think where Michael was going before about Popper is a good place to go back to, because I think that there are basically key values that make us liberal democracies, and we have to defend those, I think. And I think it should be taken for granted that if you come to a liberal democracy, there are certain things you have to sign up for. And I think one is actually free speech, ironically, because I think it's sort of being a bit eroded from within. But I think there's a role for sort of civics courses to make clear that our societies, the freedoms that we enjoy, actually rest on certain fundamental values. And you've basically got to sign up to those. But it's very important to remain clear about what we're trying to encourage, what this national culture that we're trying to encourage, because it's not about drinking tea at 5 o'clock. That's not definitive of what being British is. That something maybe lots of Brits enjoy, and it's not. I don't have anything against that. In fact, I do it myself. But that's not the same as these kind of fundamental values that we're trying to instill. And I think there's often the temptation. I mean, maybe this is the case sometimes in France, in my humble opinion, that occasionally they will defend something and say, okay, because I think they're quite critical, for example, of the wearing of veils in public. And they'll say, well, this is just fundamentally about liberal democracy. And in some of those cases, I think, is that really, or is that just something that you think is characteristic of liberal democracy because you associate it with your own French culture? I don't know. So some of the boundaries there can also be a bit tricky. But so I think it's good to build a sort of national culture of liberal democracy. I think what a lot of conservatives would say nowadays is just that culture of liberal democracy that all of us here are agreeing would be a good thing to instill. It's sort of deeply unsexy in a sense. It doesn't really kind of get us going in the way. I mean, Michael's interesting because he doesn't have any kind of interest in, I say to him, oh, did you see the All Blacks? He doesn't have interest in sport either, but he has no kind of feeling like, oh yes, the All Blacks won. I think a lot of people do have that, and not everybody, but like it's a very common human thing that you kind of like your side. And it's very easy actually to get people to wave flags at football matches and stuff in general. Here, I think the libertarian, cosmopolitan liberal mindset is actually a bit of an exception. So the trick is to try and sort of make people dedicated to liberal democratic ideas in the same way as they very easily get eager and zealous about flags and football matches and things like that.
Totally agree. When Pakistan and England and New Zealand are in a cricket tournament, I am a mess. But you see,
well, I suppose you can't lose anyway.
I can't lose. Yeah. But actually, it's fascinating because in the end, I mean, I'm like Michael. I mean, rugby does not interest me, and I'm not the typical Kiwi bloke. I'm just not. But I still, for me, Pakistan is the land of my birth, and there's a tug there. I was 3 years old when I left, but I still have that connections, sort of tribal stuff, I suppose. But in the end, I still, after 40 something years in New Zealand, I sort of, I consider myself, and I'm proud to be a New Zealander because of a set of values that I think it sort of espouses, without being the flag waving, patriot. I can do that, and it's that sense of belonging that I think is really, really important.
A thought that this is bringing to mind, to take it back to the free speech thing, actually, if I think about what I love about New Zealand, it's a sort of relaxed attitude about things. And I wonder if, a way to avoid having to worry about free speech or hate speech legislation, and to get round the problem of that people will say offensive things, is a sort of twofold thing. One is to defend everybody's right to be who they are, and for that to be enough of a national value that we don't need to suppress anything through law, because if people say awful things, then enough other people will stand up and defend the people who are being vilified and put the offending party in their box. But also another part of that I wonder if we need to focus some attention on our education system is just being a bit thick-skinned about ideas and disagreement. And that's something that New Zealanders aren't so good at, I think, is being able to have an intellectual argument that might even get heated without taking it personally and without making that, an issue. And it seems to me that that's a really strong culture where you can do that, where people can really thrash out ideas and sort of live with disagreement and live with the idea that you're not going to convince everybody of your own point of view, but accept that it is all part of a mix that leads to perhaps a better approximation of the truth, whether that's in science or law or politics.
Yeah, completely agree. I don't think Kiwis are very good at that.
No.
Yeah.
Sorry,
it brings to mind another sort of related issue about, I think it's what you're saying really, but the bubbles that we all live in, and to what extent this free speech debate is also about our inability our ability rather to get into groupthink, that in our social circles, in what we read and what we do, etc., that we close off more and more. It's back to the identity stuff, I suppose, but there's that argument as well that that free speech thing is being limited.
Maybe that's another manifestation or something that's attributable to social media. The more time people spend online in bubbles where they associate with people who think the same as them and say, bad things about people who think differently, the more polarized we get. Whereas, perhaps in the past, and perhaps still for older generations, when you socialize physically with people, whether that be through, church groups or other community groups or political parties even, because even political parties can be broad churches, that you mix naturally with people who have different ideas, and you get used to having people with different ideas around you and liking them for who they are while disagreeing with some of what they think.
So should the debate be focused on the extremes of free speech and hate speech, or should it be focused on free speech? We are actually limiting by virtue of social media, etc., and that we're putting people in bubbles, or people are putting themselves in bubbles, and actually in a way limiting their ability to speak freely, because we're limiting their ability to think freely.
Exactly.
So is that the bigger problem? I mean, should we be focusing on that rather than a few people going to do a bit of hate speech?
That would be my view, and I think especially with young people who have grown up with social media as a fact of life, we've done far too little to protect them from its deleterious effects, allowed them to go into these zones where they just get drawn into groups that say extreme things. And by extreme things, I don't necessarily mean, racist or homophobic things, but just nasty things about other people and vilifying one another for their ideas. It seems to me, I don't go on Twitter at all, but from what I can see of it, it's a place which is just rife with insults and trading of very superficial thought bites or something, rather than nuanced argument and debate.
Yeah. It's not just about it. I read the Guardian online. I watch Al Jazeera News, and then I get a subscription to something called the Daily Caller, which is a Trump mouthpiece,
right,
and a few other stuff. And it's fascinating getting the feeds and getting a different view on the same thing. And I suppose what I'm saying is the free speech, free thinking, for me is, it's not just about being critical of people, but just not actually having the ability to think outside the particular bubble or square you're in, and thereby making yourself so much more vulnerable to misleading information, unscientific stuff, hate speech or whatever. So it's that, to me, that is a crisis that is occurring in society right now, and I don't know what we do about it, but I think it's critical.
Yeah, and one of the difficulties is that, of course, Twitter is not going away. I mean, we could ban social media, but that would be a very authoritarian thing in its own right. And people enjoy going on social media, or they think they do. I'm in that group of people. I think I enjoy Twitter, but then it seems to sort of raise my heart rate a little bit. But anyway, you're not going to stop. You're not going to uninvent these technologies, and you're not going to stop people going on them. So what do you do? And I mean, one thing I've been thinking about more these days is these websites as kind of institutions. They all have slightly different settings. And I think when these social media sites first started out, people, or at least, people in my age bracket and up, were kind of like, well, what's the difference? Twitter is like this. Twitter has, shorter statements. Facebook, you can make longer posts. Otherwise, they're just kind of the same. And I think one of the things that we're learning is that these little tweaks, these little differences between these environments can actually have big effects in the way that people interact. So I think the way forward is maybe to think harder about how we design these spaces so that two things are possible. One is that we don't limit speech and people can sort of say what they want and express themselves. But the other is, so we design these spaces so that they don't seem to have this feature that they make people go completely crazy. And I don't know exactly what that number two would involve, but for me, it would look something like what you're doing naturally. And I think you're doing something which I can remember people doing when I was at university in the UK. There was a junior common room, where the students would hang out, and there would be the Guardian and the Telegraph and the Times and the Independent and whatever else, and maybe, some tabloids as well. And I would go in, and one day I'd read the Guardian, the next day I'd read the Telegraph, I'd read a bit of both. And you'd think, okay, that's what the Tories are thinking. That's what the Labour types are thinking. And if we can somehow sort of design that in to the system, at least exposing people to these different things. We can't force people to read things they don't want to read, obviously, unless you're a university lecturer. But I think that has to be the way forward.
Can we build it into our education system? Should we be, from primary school onwards, getting children to engage in constructive disagreement and to get used to being around different ideas, and make our classrooms places where people can freely explore what they think, and actually structure that a bit and train our teachers to do it?
Yeah. It's in the curriculum now, isn't it? We've something about critical thinking. I think it's there. But
I don't think they know what they mean by that often, though.
I don't know. And I don't know how you do that. It's an amazing, particularly when you've got, when you're I mean, the teachers in the schools with the best will in the world will have their worldviews and so et cetera, et cetera. But having said that, yeah, I agree. There's something in there about the citizens of societies becoming much more critical about the news feeds and the information that they're receiving, and how do you do that? I mean, I'm interested. Something like the BBC in the UK still manages to, although it's criticised, I know, as a public broadcaster, it still has. I don't know whether you agree on this, but it still has a degree of support as a reasonably independent news source, which I don't know if you agree with that. But
yeah, it obviously has a degree of support. I mean, I think that it's been interesting for me to watch as well, because again, I remember when I was in Britain in the 90s and sort of noughties, the BBC was incredibly well respected, and I'd almost say among a lot of people in the UK, it was almost pervasively influential. That you turn on the radio, there were 4 or 5 BBC radio channels, and there were, it was on TV. It was sort of everywhere, and people generally did trust it and then enjoyed the whole mythology of Auntie during the war. And I have seen that shift. I have seen that chipped away at quite a lot over the past few years, and I can't decide whether it is because the BBC has sort of compromised its own values in some ways, or whether it's all just part of this polarization that everybody just starts seeing anything marginally left-wing as kind of bankrupt, or if they're on the right, or anything marginally right-wing as bankrupt or if they're on the left.
Yeah. I don't know either. I agree with you.
There's an extent to which I think they've shot themselves in the foot. I mean, doing things like banning episodes of Fawlty Towers because, they make anti-German statements or something. No. I mean, that kind of thing is a red rag to a bull, isn't it? I mean, to many people for whom Fawlty Towers is an iconic television series, including myself. I think how utterly nuts are we? Are we really saying that comedy has got to watch itself? I mean, there's no comedy anymore once you get into that kind of degree of self-examination.
Totally agree. I suppose where I was going was that business about newsfeed or bringing different perspectives on situations.
Oh, yeah.
That somewhere along the line, we've got to get to that position. And I was thinking whether a public broadcaster idea is one of the threads that we might want to pursue, because we don't really like that anymore, do we?
Well, it's great if you can actually ensure its independence and that it's seen to be independent. And I mean, the public broadcasting such as we have in New Zealand, RNZ, for example, cops its degree of criticism for lack of independence, and how you actually maintain a charter of independence in polarized times. I suppose that's the problem, or the potential problem, with that solution.
It's a multifaceted. I mean, there's that, and then there's the debates about breaking up some of the social media companies, having more competition, and looking at some of the algorithms that they produce and how they produce them and how they create your news feed and providing people with them. There must be a whole pile of things that we could be thinking about to ensure that our citizens have access to a broad range of ideas.
Indeed. Regrettably, the country that has to do that is the most polarized of them all, because that's where the social media companies live at the moment.
Yeah, I know.
Well, I think that the libertarian criticism of an organization like the BBC, or a situation where the BBC kind of held sway over a nation, was that it was a kind of informational bottleneck and it was controlled by people at the top. And the great hope of new media and of the internet was that there'd be all these citizen journalists and people could say what they want. And to a large extent that has been true, and it is true. I think it looked more hopeful when the internet first came in, that there'd be all these small producers. But I think what we've seen over time is, as in pretty much any industry in the history of economics, we've seen kind of big tech barons take over and just be astoundingly successful. And now you've effectively got these sort of monopolies. And what's happened now is that I think the public space is basically created, or to a large degree, the public space is inhabited by Twitter and Facebook. Not just inhabited, they define it, right? And they sort of say what you can and cannot say. in public. So actually, these private companies have actually taken over to an extent that they're playing the role of the state, but they don't have the democratic accountability of a state institution. So I don't know if this is what you sort of had in mind, but one idea that I've played with, this isn't a very libertarian idea, but one idea I've played around with is maybe there should be a kind of state social media platform. You can be like the New Zealand book or whatever, or that's not a very good name. Obviously, I'm not in tech. You can tell, not a very sexy name. But and we could get a whole committee together and decide exactly what it needs to look like. We can make sure that there's a free speech a regulation which is fair to different sides of the political spectrum, and we could try and think really hard about the kinds of incentives that the site generates, so that it doesn't sort of push people just to being radicalized.
Yeah. What I mean, yeah. I mean, we got to start to address the issues, and I can't see any. I think people are putting it into the too hard basket, aren't they? I mean, how do we possibly do that? But I suppose I'll repeat that. It just occurs to me that the free speech argument is being dashed in a way by social media. You get on social media and you say something unpopular, and you're likely to get cancelled pretty quickly, one way or the other. So,
yeah.
So you don't need laws for that. It's actually happening. And
it can't be healthy for democracy, can it? Because it just polarizes more and more and more. And I guess I suppose it's almost a warning voice that just comes up in my mind all the time, is that if we don't take it out of the too hard basket, then it will come to physical blows before we solve it. And it already has in America. We saw the riots in the middle of the year and the Capitol invasion. They're getting to the point where they're boiling over, and the National Guard's on the streets, and cities were being burned and occupied and the rest of it. And that's no way to conduct political debate and democracy. I mean, for sure there's obviously a place for civil unrest, even in protest, but when it becomes violence and an attempt to take control, that's when you're in real trouble. And so it seems to me that our politicians of goodwill on all sides have to start to think about the consequences if they don't take it out of the too hard basket and talk about it.
So my question to you, Michael, I suppose is have the universities, when we talk about free speech and combating any legislation that's going to restrict free speech, it's what you guys have talked about. My question, I suppose, is that the right place to be putting the energy, or is it somewhere else?
In universities, or?
Well, what I'm saying is, what is the most important issue here to enable and encourage people to speak freely? Is it fighting legislation against hate speech, or is it somewhere further down, deeper, in ensuring that people have access to a range of information and not limited to their bubbles? I'd
probably have to say it's both. I think that if we end up with hate speech, I think we will end up hate speech legislation. We're very likely to go down the road that Britain has, where there are cops knocking on your door, telling you off for saying something on Twitter about how there are two sexes. That's happened. They have this, what do they call it, non-criminal hate incident or something that gets registered, and then people have that on their file, and that seems to me very bad for democracy. So I don't want us to pass laws that might bring that kind of culture about and that might suppress what people are likely to say. Again, because quite apart from anything else, from a practical perspective, I don't think it works. I think it makes things worse. I think it makes people more tribalized and more polarized. But I certainly think that, we on the educational front, whether it's in the school sector or the university sector, have to take very seriously educating people to have proper discussions, and how you say things in a way that does not offend, that's one thing. So how can you actually just be civil and polite? I mean, that's part of it. But more than that, it's also just examining why we get upset when somebody disagrees with us about something that we hold as very important, and actually see that you can be around ideas that you find difficult or even offensive without letting that diminish you or taking it personally, and just being a bit more robust and educating young people to be robust in the way that they confront ideas.
Yeah. I suppose all I'm saying is that what you just described, if we can get that right, then at the other end, the hate speech end, we're going to have less of a problem.
I agree.
I mean, I definitely think there's something funny going on with the social media and the polarization issues that you're talking about. I mean, I know that some people who kind of doubt that we're in a free speech crisis, they say things like speech has never been freer. And it's kind of interesting. So what they're talking about, I think, is the fact that we have all these social media possibilities. And, you know, you go back to not that long ago, go back to the 90s again, or the 80s, you just didn't have the opportunity. There wasn't a possibility of putting out a statement of what you think or what you ate for breakfast, or, you know, what you think of the prime minister to the whole world, effectively. You would have to write a letter to the local paper, and of course that wouldn't have been seen by as many people. And most people couldn't be bothered to do that because it was actually kind of time consuming, and you had to, you know, actually put a stamp on a letter, on an envelope, and old fashioned things like that. So now we see all these views coming forth, and that's kind of beautiful. But I think it also pisses people off because, you know, in the old days, again, you would look at the paper and you'd see a letter to the editors and would say something you don't like. And then you'd have to think, well, do I write a letter back? Probably not, because I can't be bothered. You probably just put the paper down and forget about it. And now you can go online and say, I saw what you tweeted and I hate it and I think you're a bigot, or I think whatever. And so that's part of the problem. But I think that it's important to be clear, because I think the real crisis isn't so much that someone says, I don't like, you know, the prime minister, and I say, well, I do like the prime minister, so there. The problem is when it comes to these sort of cancel culture things where someone says, you said this, and so I'm going to try and get you sacked from the university. It's not that common in New Zealand, but it's been happening elsewhere, or from another job. And I think that that's where it's important to have the sort of legal infrastructure quite clear, that, you know, beyond certain very extreme cases, we want to defend the right of people to have their say on social media or whatever. And then there's this other problem that we're talking about, is things just get very nasty on social media. Things get very nasty in public discourse. But I think that that's really a problem for society and culture. I don't think that's a problem for the law.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So totally agree. So just pursuing that, I mean, why do, say, in this case, universities in the States, I understand, sacking people for saying the wrong thing, or businesses cancelling sponsorships when people say the wrong thing? That's not happening out of a legal framework. That's happening out of a social media. That's a commercial, almost a commercial.
There are certainly commercial decisions behind it, and there are also people just wanting to appear to be, you know, in the right frame or whatever, and so they condemn people that say things that are outside of that. And I agree with James, that is a cultural problem in the end, and there's no legislative solution to it. And it's hard to know what the solution even could be, other than perhaps having conversations like this one and trying to publicize a kind of more broad-minded approach to discourse.
Yeah.
It's probably all we can do as individuals, and to the extent that we have influence. I mean, you in your political circles, and we in our academic ones, trying to promote that way of doing things, and that in the end is all individuals can do. Perhaps we're not in control, nor should we be.
I think you made a good point there, that often it is sort of businesses, you know, privately making the decision to sack someone, and at the end of the day, I suppose that they have that right. Although they are also restricted in terms of why they can fire people in most countries. You know, I don't think you can sack people for their religious views. can you sack people for their political views? I mean, I think that's something that maybe does come under the legal framework. But one thing I would say, maybe in closing, is just that I think it's different for universities, because I think, maybe you're a hamburger restaurant and you don't want people to associate you with a particular view. Okay, that's one thing. But the university should, I think, be a forum for different ideas. So if you're firing someone or deplatforming them for an idea, you're just not doing the job of a university.
Completely.
So there should be very clear rules in place in institutions of cultural production. And I'd actually say similar things for a state broadcaster. I think, if the BBC fires someone, just for being a robustly right-wing Tory or something, or just for being a flaming socialist, I think that would be wrong.
I completely agree. I suppose, again, in closing, it seems to me that commercial imperative, it sort of is, it's, the customer is always right approach. So you keep coming back to, if people are firing people for saying the wrong thing, is it because they're saying the wrong thing? Or is it because their customers, whether they're university governors or funders, aren't prepared to accept it? So it always comes back for me is, what does the public think? How is this going to go down? And that business about the public discourse and what's driving that is what we need to be focusing on.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and it's also something we've discussed. Also, a sort of very unlibertarian note, but we both have concerns about the modern university, to the extent that it's become. We have reservations about this term, but to the extent that it's become neoliberal and more focused on students as customers, it's put itself in a weaker position vis-a-vis defending free speech and things. Because if the customer is not happy that you said this, then you have to satisfy the customer, right?
That's right, and it does. As somebody with fairly libertarian perspective, I freely admit that it creates a dilemma, and I would come down on the side of the cultural liberty rather than the commercial liberty in that regard. Because if the university is to do its job, it has to be a primarily cultural institution and not a commercial one. And
I agree.
And from that perspective, I've always been critical of the commercialization of the university, and now we are seeing the bitter fruit of that.
I totally agree. And it's not just that; it's the whole that neoliberal term is a wide one, I know, but it is. It's what's happened, I don't know, since the mid-'80s, I suppose. And there's a whole network of things that have gone on, which have led us to this position. Totally agree.
Well, perhaps the next time we interview, we'll talk about neoliberalism in more depth, because we've come probably to the longest episode of Free Kiwis so far, and that's a testament to what a fascinating discussion it's been. And as always, I've really enjoyed talking with you, Bali, and thank you so much for your time today. It's been great.
Good conversation, and nice to meet you, James.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that as well. I agree with what Michael said. Nice to meet you. Cheers.